the market and sells them, or sells them from his own shop. Or you have a blacksmith who does the same thing with metals, or a saddle maker, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a really inefficient way to produce things. So when large-scale factories come about, basically it drives them out of business. So with industry and steam engines, the most efficient use of producing things is in large factories, and a new structure of society is generated as a result of this. Someone has to own the factories, and then there have to be multitudes of employees that go and work for that one person. And one of the results of this is people are able to create far more products with far less energy. And you would think that the result of this would be that people would have a shorter workday. But instead, because more is produced, individual commodities are worth less in a capitalist system. So more labor time is actually necessary per person. And actually, with the rise of capitalism in England, one of the big movements you see against this is called the Luddites, and they actually rebelled against the factory system itself, went out and tried to burn down factories because they were, as handicraftsmen, they were being put out of business, and also the conditions in these factories were really horrible, and basically just society was being structured, in a way that they weren't familiar with, and they were basically against. And you can actually see the same process still occurring here in our society. Every time like a new market is opened up, you see small businessmen go and move into that market. Like a good example is like, if you guys have ever seen like the movie Walmart, the high cost of a low price. But basically it just goes over how when Walmart comes into like a neighborhood, all the small scale retailers end up getting pushed out of business because of course Walmart is a much bigger retailing system, has access to more cheaper labor, and basically is able to outsell all these small business owners. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit of like the history of capitalism, right? When we talk about the way capitalism was created, like a lot of people, like Adam Smith, I guess basically his idea was, he just said like, oh well, the way it started is that there were industrious people who were frugal and hardworking, and then there were people that weren't. And the people that were hardworking, they became the current, ruling class. And the people that, weren't hardworking, they became the employees. And of course, like, this story is not at all true. And it also kind of goes into Adam Smith's theory that, like, okay, well, the best way to run capitalism is to have, like, as little state as possible. And that, and a lot of right-wing people these days talk about, like, how, like, capitalism means less government, and socialism is big government. And they kind of set up a false dichotomy like that, like capitalism is liberty and socialism is, less liberty or slavery or serfdom or whatever you want to call it. But of course, this is complete nonsense, right? The history of capitalism is completely different. The way it came about was through the bourgeoisie using the state to guarantee their own interests in order to create the property that they got in the first place. And this is where property came from. Through utilizing the state to take away property from the commons, right? From communal farmlands, from communal herding grounds, and things like that, and give that to individual producers, individuals within the bourgeoisie. A good example of this is English farmland. Through the Enclosure Acts during the 18th and 19th century, about 11,000 square miles were enclosed. They were taken from communal agriculture practices and put in the hands of a few wealthy individuals. George Orwell actually said, "Stop to consider how the so-called owners of land got hold of it. They simply seized it by force, afterwards hiring lawyers to provide them with title deeds. In the case of the enclosure of common lands, which was going on from about 1600 to 1850, the land grabbers did not even have the excuse of being foreign conquerors. They were quite frankly taking the heritage of their own countrymen upon no sort of pretext except that they had the power to do so." In America, a similar thing happened, except it was foreign conquerors who did it to them, and that was the Native Americans, right? They basically most land among Native Americans was communally owned, and in order for capitalism to get off the ground here, that land had to be broken down into parcels and given to individuals. That's the way primitive accumulation occurred here in the United States. Basically, and once again, this required a massive state, a massive violent state in order to accomplish this. So this is basically the state-enforced robbery of land, and state-enforced, and of course, getting off the ground with this, it also required the slavery. The state needed to enforce slavery in the South in order for the United States to have the strong economy that enabled it to dominate the world, and that enabled capitalism to dominate the world. I mean, even similar to the Enclosure Acts that happened in England, in America you have the General Allotment Act. So once, you know, the Native American tribes were conquered and put onto reservations where they had, you know, still their communal ownership of land was still in place, then the United States, in order to try to integrate American Indians into capitalism, passed the General Allotment Act in 1891, and this basically divided tribally held lands into individually owned parcels and opened up surplus land to settlement and development by non-American Indians. And of course, when you give away small parcels, not give away, but introduce small-scale ownership of land into a society that's incredibly impoverished, it's very easily for that land to be then taken away from these people because, you know, of course, they become in debt really quick and they need to be able to sell off their land in order to survive. Another interesting example of this more recently is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was passed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And one of the things about this was after the Mexican Revolution back in the, I can't remember what year, but early 1900s?
1910.
1910, thank you. Part of their constitution.
You're talking about the Mexican Revolution?
Yeah, part of their constitution was it guaranteed the communally owned agricultural lands that could not be taken away from it, could not be given to foreigners. NAFTA forced the Mexican government to rewrite their constitution to get rid of that clause, to both allow for the breakdown of communally owned farms and to allow those to be bought up by foreign corporations. And this is exactly what happened, because once again, just like the Native Americans, a lot of these people, you know, quickly became or were already indebted and needed to sell off their land in order to survive. And this resulted in, you know, 2 million Mexican farmers being pushed off their land. And basically, so historically, this is where the working class comes from, right? Because you're going to need a lot of people to go away from the agricultural production and into the cities in order to become wage workers, right? So people are no longer tied to their land to produce food and things like that. So they need to seek employment elsewhere, and they do this by going to the cities to work in factories, and they usually end up in nowadays in large slums. And so, I mean, the number of people living in slums worldwide has increased by 55 million in the last, I believe it's 10 years. Yeah. And then one more example of privatization, right? In Russia, right, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they did a poll, and they asked people, like, how would you like the state-owned industries to be distributed? And most people said, oh, we'd like them to be given to workers' collectives and things like that. That's the kind of thing we favor. But of course, the state, as I'm trying to push through, the state is absolutely necessary for the proliferation of capitalism in the first place. And so the state, instead the state assets were auctioned off to corporations for very little money, and price controls were lifted, and of course unemployment skyrocketed in Russia as a result. And so, all right, so kind of having established a little bit of like how capitalism institutes itself, I want to talk a little bit more about what capitalism is and what that means for us as workers. And so there's a few different concepts that I need to talk about in order to try to illustrate that. All right, the first is commodities. And commodities have two different kinds of value. They have use value and exchange value. The use value of a commodity is basically, the value in using something, right? So an egg salad sandwich, its use value is in eating it, unless you're vegan. A car, the use value in that is the driving of it. And basically this exists independently of the commodity entering the market. Exchange value is the value of that commodity relative to all other objects in the commodity, right? The used car equals a fraction of a house, mini dinners for a couple $1,000s. And this is how it exists within the market. All right, and the next concept we need to talk about is labor. A labor is basically something that everybody has, and it's basically a worker's life activity. It's anything they do to kind of manipulate the world around them. It's a manifestation of your life, a manifestation of how you spend your time. And so, since all we have is our time and our bodies, like, it's basically a manifestation of your life. Under capitalism, this becomes a commodity. But it's a unique commodity from all other commodities because it produces new commodities. So it can take an empty field and make it into a farm, steel and make it into a skyscraper, and most human labor utilizes tools to do this. All right, next concept is wages. And while wages can vary with the market, the trend is for them to level down to the cost necessary for keeping a worker alive. Keeping a worker alive, working, and capable of reproducing. And this is basically the exchange value of labor. The worker gets a fixed sum regardless of what the capitalist makes off his labor power. And here's the most important part, and this is kind of the essential thing that makes capitalism what it is. Without this, there could not be a bourgeoisie, and there could not be a working class, or a proletariat rather. And this is surplus value. And basically, this is what a capitalist sells the product for more than he paid the worker to make it, right? So you have the cost of raw materials, and you have the cost of the person's labor, and yet when he goes to the market and he sells this product, he makes more than he paid for both of those things. Now, where did that value come from? This is where exploitation occurs. Because if you think about it, let's say a work day, you separate it into the hours. Say 8-hour work day. You have the first 4 hours, and then you have the next 4 hours. And let's say that you, in that first 4 hours, you produce basically the exchange value, you produce the value of the products that you're creating, right? And so for that next 4 hours, basically you're spending that time, that's basically a free gift to your employer, which he then creates surplus value out of. So next time you're at your job, and you work for your first 4 hours, and then you spend the next time, remember that that's just a donation you're giving to your boss, so that he can reinvest that and get even more rich off of it. And this value, this surplus value, when it's accumulated, it's called capital. And the more capital owned by the ruling class, the poorer and more powerless is the working class. And right here I want to talk about another concept real quick that's very pertinent today, which is, which Marx calls the reserve army of labor. Today this is more commonly called unemployment. And here's a quote from Marx real quick. He says, "Big industry constantly requires a reserve army of unemployed workers for times of overproduction. The main purpose of the bourgeois in relation to the worker is, of course, to have the commodity labor as cheaply as possible, which is only possible when the supply of this commodity is as large as possible in relation to the demand for it, i.e. when the overpopulation is the greatest. Overpopulation, therefore, is in the interest of the bourgeoisie." By overpopulation, what he means right here is just any population that exceeds kind of basically society's ability to provide for them. So basically what he's saying, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. You just bouncing anything?
Just bouncing, sorry.
No problem. So basically what he's saying is that when the supply of labor, of everyone's ability to work, is greater than the demand for it, i.e. the supply of jobs, then the commodity that laborers are able to sell is worth even less. And this is good. This is good for capitalism, and this helps create more capital. So when wages are getting lowered, and when there's more unemployment, this is actually something that's good. It's good for the economy, and it's good for the bourgeoisie. It actually sucks for the rest of us, but you can see right here like this, what we would call a contradiction of capitalism, right? Where something that's good for the ruling class is actually bad for everyone else. And this isn't like, it's interesting because this isn't like a really big secret or anything. I mean, actually, have a quote from Mitt Romney, actually, ironically, where he says, and he's not saying this as like it's a bad thing either. He's like, for an economy to thrive as ours does, there are a lot of people who will suffer as a result of that. He actually said this in defense of him, like basically losing like 15,000 jobs when he drove KB Toys out of business, which I just found out today. What's up, man?
Yeah, just to add on that, on a theoretical level, there's this concept called Pareto optimality. And I know we've been going through like a lot of concepts or whatever, but traditionally you'll hear like someone who defends capitalism say, well, capitalism is just an exchange of commodities, you know? I get your money and you get, your, like, flurry from McDonald's or whatever. There's equality in that. But essentially what I see in the problem with this concept of Pareto optimality is that there's inherent exploitation in the fact that someone got those wages from a job that paid them, half of what their work was actually worth. You know what I'm saying? So in regards to, oh, I'm sorry. I actually just lost. What was your last point? I had a full circle coming around.
It was a Mitt Romney quote. Was my last point.
Oh yeah, Pareto optimality. So first in the, first in the exchange of commodities itself, but also in the market as a whole. Capitalism has to thrive with unemployment. There has to be unemployment. It's a Pareto optimality of the marketplace. So anytime there's a crisis, say housing market, 2008. I hope this isn't too tangential.
No, go for it.
Then this is an inevitable part of capitalism, right? It has to have crises to save itself, and it has to have inequality. It has to have unemployment. So I don't know. Just to add on that exchange thing, it's called Pareto optimality, but I don't know if anybody would remember that.
Well, that's awesome.
So
because it actually leads right into my next point, my last point about capitalism,
right?
right?
Pass the lemonade.
Yeah. Where'd it go?
I actually
have some on
freeze
my
because I'm
shirt
like,
if you want
that's
that.
what
You have one right there, and then this one.
Thank you.
No problem, brother.
You pass that one.
So yeah, that segues really nicely into kind of my last point on capitalism, which is overproduction and capitalist crises. And I'm not going to go into this a lot because actually our next week's topic is on that, which Steve and Brett will be giving. Yeah, which should be awesome. But basically, it's here, I have a little quote here. If capitalists win the class struggle to push wages down and labor effort up, raising the rate of surplus value, then a capitalist economy faces regular problems of inadequate consumer demand, right? So if you're not paying people enough, and you're producing way too many, and you're producing a lot of commodities, then people aren't going to be able to afford the shit that they're actually producing. This leads to a crisis in the economy. And there's really interesting ways really horrible ways that capitalist governments try to take care of these. That you have people living in poverty, not able to afford stuff. So what do you do with all the stuff that's produced? You destroy it. So if people are really hungry and they're not able to afford grain, then you burn the grain. And this happened during the Great Depression. But it's also happening today, right? Where you have the housing crisis, where people aren't able to afford the homes, and there's a surplus of the production of homes. So what do banks do? They send out bulldozers to homes, and they bulldoze them, right? When people, when homelessness is on the rise in America, we're actually bulldozing homes, and this is what capitalism looks like, I guess. Another way to try to solve the problem of overproduction and crises is the opening up of new markets. And one excellent way to do this is by invading another country to open up a market that was previously closed. So Iraq, for instance, and I think this quote is Naomi Klein, where she says, "The U.S. has no intention of actually getting out of Iraq. It wants its troops to remain, and it wants Bechtel, MCI, and Halliburton to stay behind and run the water system, the phones, and the oil fields." Because these were ways of opening up new markets to create, to basically generate more capital as a result of that. And of course, Iraq's just one example of this. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interventions that the U.S. has done across the globe. Apparently I had a list, but I lost it. But that's okay.
The United States has 400 military bases in over 100 countries. think about the major ones that receive the highest amount of funding, the ones that coincidentally have huge oil reserves or huge resources that, right, the U.S. want, or NATO or the UN wants to have their hands on, but they can't do it through economic means, right? At least at an immediate level. So they'll do a smash and grab and take it, like Iraq or Iran in the most recent case, or Syria.
Just a minor correction, I think it's closer to 800, 780 or something.
Oh well,
Maybe
yeah,
30.
yeah, man, you would know, man. Really, I'm like way rusty on my stats, so hell yeah.
Cool. All right, so having covered capitalism, actually next thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about revolution. So basically, as I kind of tried to point out earlier, the state exists for the interests of the ruling class in a given country. The state exists for the suppression of one class by another. Laws must exist to create new markets, defend property, and ensure regular economic function. The state exists to protect the system of capital and not just individual capitalists. So, every once in a while it may send a Martha Stewart to jail, but in general it's defending the interests of the capitalist class. And I actually have a quote here from William Paul that comes from The State, Its Origins and Function. And he says, "The political state throughout history has meant the government of men by the ruling classes. The Republic of Socialism will be the government of industry administered on behalf of the whole community. The former meant the economic and political subjection of the many. The latter will mean the economic freedom of all. It will therefore be a true democracy." Now, there's several different ways to kind of conceive of this. One is, so the anarchists basically believe in the immediate abolition of the state in order, through power transfer to autonomous workers' collectives. Then there's basically the Leninist view.
I have a question. What's an autonomous worker thingy that you said? What is
Yes,
that?
okay. So they believe in the democratic control of, say, a factory, right? So in each of these cases, the idea is taking the means of production out of the hands of the current ruling class and putting it in the hands of the working class, of the people who are actually working in these factories. So, like, a good example of a somewhat anarchist form of this would be currently in, like, Argentina, and maybe AJ could actually talk a little bit about this, but people when they had a big economic crisis and left a lot of factories unoccupied, and workers actually went in and took over the factories themselves.
Yeah, they formed small cooperatives to administrate the factories that were taken over from the bourgeois.
I think the biggest one is Dragon Corp, right?
In Spain, yeah.
Like around 100,000 workers, like producing everything, like steel, high-tech stuff.
Is that a contemporary example?
It is, yeah. It's been like for more than 60 years, founded in 43 maybe, or something like that.
After the Spanish Civil War?
Mm-hmm.
Even after
Right.
Franco and everything?
I mean, there might be some like
something going on there.
Yes,
in
with
between.
Franco's blessing.
So this is in Spain, not
That is correct.
No.
In Spain, yeah.
No.
So yeah, that's kind of the idea. And so basically, anarchists believe that, once again, both communists and anarchists agree that this is a part of the revolution and an essential part of the revolution, that workers control, right, like this is how the Russian Revolution started as well. Basically, workers went and took over their factories and operated them democratically, and that's actually the word Soviet. That's what that means. It's a worker-controlled factory. And so, through the anarchist view, basically, society would be based on a federation of all of these worker collectives joining together, and basically all of them having equal rights in kind of a council type setting. And there would be no need for a state in this case, just the federation of anarchist collectives. The Leninist view is slightly different. Basically, they believe that the state, that the state is necessary, not the current state that we have now, but a state is necessary to defend the revolution against against both counter-revolutionaries, you know, the bourgeoisie and people who are against the revolution within the country, as well as against foreign invasion. This has proved to be a fairly important thing throughout history because, you know, in Spain, obviously, like the anarchists there, during the Spanish Revolution, there were a lot of anarchist collectives set up at that time, but they, of course, lost a war against the fascists, Franco, who was mentioned earlier. And so the Leninists believe that a state is necessary to defend these gains and to try to organize the state or organize society in such a way as to be able to perpetuate the gains of the workers' revolution. But they don't believe that the current state, right? It's not like the idea of like a lot of Republicans have of like, oh, you know, Obama's making socialism because the state is going and giving a lot of money to like like GM and stuff. Like, that's not the idea that the Leninists have, right? They believe that this state is set up to defend the interests of the bourgeoisie, and that this state must be smashed, and that the new one must be based on, you know, workers' collectives, unions, and things like that. Lenin says the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. It has to smash it and create its own state that's more conducive to workers' control. And I think a pretty interesting example of this that's happening currently is in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, where they just passed I can't remember the name of the law, but it's like the law of the communes, which basically invests more political power in workers' communes that are being set up throughout the country in order to try to go, you know, bypass the bourgeois state that's been set, that's, you know, that has existed there. Another example that kind of both Leninists and anarchists draw their theory from is the Paris Commune, and we're actually going to have a bigger lecture on this in 3 weeks. Brett will be given that. But Engels, and basically the Paris Commune happened in 1871, right? 1871, and it was the workers of Paris rising up and, you know, basically taking control of society with, you know, with these same kind of councils and things like that. And I just have a quote from Engels on that. And he says, "The commune was formed of municipal councillors chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at any time. The majority of its members were naturally working men or acknowledged representatives of the working class. The police, which until then had been the instrument of the government, was at once stripped of its political attributes and turned into the responsible and at times revocable agent of the commune. So were the officials of all other branches of the administration. From the members of the commune downwards, the public service had to be done at workmen's wages. The privileges and the representation allowances of the high dignitaries of state disappeared along with the high dignitaries themselves. Having once got rid of the standing army and the police, the instruments of physical force of the old government, the commune proceeded at once to break the instrument of spiritual repression. The power of the priests, the judicial functionaries lost that sham independence. They were thenceforth to be elective, responsible, and revocable." So the idea is that the representatives that each of the municipalities within Paris elected, they were only paid workmen's wages. They were subject to being revoked at any time if they, you know, no longer represented the will of their constituency. And yeah, basically they broke down the old power structures based around, you know, clergymen, nobles, and of course the bourgeois state that existed. Now another aspect of revolution that's been a prevalent part of most revolutions that have occurred is kind of the liberation from old and oppressive traditions. A good example of this was was the Chinese Revolution with regards to women's rights. I mean, before the revolution, women were subject to arranged marriages, spousal abuse was legalized, a lot of women had to do foot binding, you know, where they would wrap their feet up to make it look more pretty and also make it harder for them to get away, basically. And it was also very difficult to attain divorce. And basically after the revolution, they abolished all of these old traditions that were, you know, basically instituted and said like, oh, this is part of our culture, this is part of our religion, and women need to be subject to this. And one of the things that revolution does is that it breaks down these traditions that are entrenched in society in order to try to liberate people. Another central aspect of revolution should be the end of imperialism. And we talked a little bit about imperialism earlier when we talked about Iraq. And what this means is the self-determination of oppressed nationalities. And this is the right of nations to decide their own destiny and how they want to develop for themselves, as opposed to having somebody else's economic system imposed on them, having, basically having their resources stolen from them to prop up, as currently happens, to prop up first world economies. So this means that a country that undergoes revolution should no longer engage in imperial interventions abroad. And in Russia, a very interesting thing happened. I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but it was a policy called Korenizats. You know what? Never mind. But basically, it just translates to indigenization is the idea. And this was a policy that basically there were Russia was previously an empire, had gone out and conquered all these various nations, and so there, within the Russian Empire there were various nationalities. And after the Russian Revolution, they kind of sought out these different nationalities, gave them basically an autonomous status where they encouraged that the language, that their indigenous language be spoken there. They encouraged their culture, and they encouraged self-governance in these regions. And in my opinion, I think this has implications for the U.S., which also gains its territory through imperial interventions and through slavery. And there are various nation groups that are currently contained within the United States, such as the Puerto Ricans, such as the Black Belt of African Americans in the South, the Hawaiian nations, and Native Americans as well. That revolution in America, and also the Chicanos as well. The revolution in America would mean self-determination for these peoples because their land was stolen from them, and they've basically had foreign governments imposed upon them. And okay, so the last part of my lecture is to talk a little bit about socialism. And here I'm going to talk about what I see as examples of the gains of socialism, and in particular I'm going to focus on Russia and Cuba. Now both of these, right, like these countries, I mean, like say we got our Trotskyists here who don't think that Russia was socialist after a certain amount of time, but I think it's important while they weren't like the end all be all to what we should strive for. We can do better. We can do better than they did. Yeah, I think currently, but we should also be able to learn from them, to learn from what they went through, and to also see that the enormous gains that were made as a result of these revolutions. So first I'm going to talk about Russia, and I just basically have a few different statistics that I'm going to go through. So in 1966, a leading U.S. medical journal wrote that life expectancy in Russia was doubled in the last 50 years. At the present time, the Soviet Union graduates annually about as many physicians as there were in the whole Russian Empire before the First World War. Of all the physicians in the world today, more than 1 in 5 is Soviet, while only one person in 14 in the world today is a Soviet citizen. Now we need to take into account that when the Russian Revolution happened, they went through a massive civil war. They were invaded by, 16 different countries. And yet, despite that, they underwent the fastest industrialization the world had ever seen to that point. And along with that, they were able to guarantee. I mean, one of the first acts they did was to create universal free healthcare, universal free education. And of course, the gains of this are readily apparent in these statistics I'm going to give. So literacy rates before the revolution in 1917 hardly reached 40%. They were much less in rural areas, and they were lower still among women. And by the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, literacy rates were higher in Russia than they were in the West. By 1938, the 21 years of Soviet rule had brought about a 50% reduction in the child mortality rate. The height of the average Soviet child in 1938 was 1¼ inches greater than the average child in Tsarist Russia. And height is actually a really good indicator of nutrition in a society. The weight of the average Soviet child was 11.5 pounds greater in 1937 than in 1925. The chest expansion of the average Soviet child in 1938 was roughly 1 inch greater than the average child in Tsarist Russia. Incidence of tuberculosis decreased by 83% over Soviet rule up till 1938 and continued to decrease. The death rate in 1937 in the USSR was 40% below the death rate in Russia in 1930. So these are all gains that they made as a direct result of the revolution. The USSR's life expectancy was consistently well above the world average. Now, another thing we need to take into account is that Russia was basically behind all of Europe before the revolution. It was basically like the most backwards country in Europe, and would be considered a third world country. And yet, so the USSR's life expectancy was consistently well above world average afterwards. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, right, that thing that's everybody says is like such a good thing for world democracy and all that jazz, their life expectancy plummeted significantly. Between 1988 and 1994, Russia's life expectancy dropped by a full 5 years, dropping below the world average for the first time since the gains of socialism were made. Russia's life expectancy to date, 20 years after the fall of socialism, has still not managed to regain its pre-collapse levels. So their life expectancy is still lower today than it was in the 80s. In 1993, a UNICEF inquiry estimated that 500,000 extra deaths a year result from the capitalist reforms that have taken place in Russia. Russia's social policy chief estimates that 25% of the population has fallen below subsistence levels, once again since the fall of the Soviet Union, while the new rulers have gained enormous wealth. And Russia's suicide rate has doubled since 1990. It was 39.7% per 1,000, which is twice the world average. Go for it.
Just on a cultural level, is anybody like way into film? Like, because what you'll notice is right after 1990, you see this huge influx of like gangster and crime films, which are they're great films. But you basically see a social unrest happen right after 1991. You know, all for the freedom to own private property. I don't know, just as a side. Because we were looking at Russian cinema earlier today. So, yeah, check it out.
All right, and so that next I'm going to talk a little bit about Cuba. Now, once again, another thing to take into account about Cuba is that not only, so they fought a revolution which they won in 1959, and since then the United States has funded terrorism against their country. They've had an embargo ever since then, a blockade basically, so they're preventing them from trading with the United States and other countries. And there have been various assassination attempts against their leaders, and it's basically been an unrelenting, still kind of Cold War against Cuba ever since they first became socialist, ever since they actually first nationalized American property within Cuba. And before the revolution, Cuba was basically a puppet state of the United States government. It was the playground for American gangsters. And yeah, like on another film note, Godfather Part 2, like that all takes place in Cuba because like that's where organized crime went, because it was like this big place where they could just, you know, take whatever they wanted and do whatever they wanted.
It was the Al Capone's getaway.
And it was also a capitalist country.
Yes, also a capitalist country.
With feudal-like economic conditions.
So, as a result of the revolution in Cuba, primary education completion, right? They're just children who are basically complete primary education is better than it is in the United States. And of course, before the Cuban Revolution, the United States, their primary completion rate was almost double what Cuba's is. So you can see like just a complete reversal of things as a result of the revolution there. The Cuban infant mortality rate is also better than the United States. You know, the United States, this country that's, you know, the wealthiest in the world, is basically extracting all this wealth from the rest of the world, and it's still not able to ensure an infant mortality rate better than a small, you know, third world country that they're, you know, having an embargo against and, you know, funding terrorism against. And the Cuban infant mortality rate is actually the lowest in the entire hemisphere. the Cuban child, and that the infant mortality rate is actually also a really good indicator of, you know,
How the established infrastructure is.
no, it's the,
Human Development Index.
yes, Human Development Index, right. Cuban child malnutrition in the year 2000 was just 3.4. Now, by comparison, that same year, Haiti, a similar country just right across, you know, just a couple of miles, you know, dozens of miles south, Haiti's child malnutrition rate at that same time was 13.4. The thing to keep in mind is that this is during Cuba's special period, where they were unable to import very much food or fertilizer because their primary trade partner, the Soviet Union, had obviously collapsed, and they were no longer able to import things. And yet, during that time, they were able to maintain a child malnutrition rate better than a capitalist country just down the way from them. I mean, much, much better. Cuban life expectancy, in 1960, a year after the revolution, the life expectancy was 63.9. And this was six full years behind what the U.S.'s was. Today, despite the massive embargo, Cuba has a better life expectancy than the United States. And in basically every country that's fought for socialist reforms or socialism, you can see this. You can see basically rather incredible feats of you know, literacy rates going up, life expectancies, infant mortality rates, and that actually point to the actual ability of socialism to deal better with supplying humanity's needs than capitalism ever could, despite what they tell us about socialism not working and all that nonsense. So anyways, that's it. We can move to discussion now and just kind of question and answer period.
Let's give him a hand.